In the spring of 1945, as the last embers of the Third Reich guttered out across a shattered continent, a quiet but remarkable series of conversations took place in Allied prisoner collection points scattered across Germany and Austria. The men being led through the wire were not ordinary soldiers. They were generals, architects of campaigns that had swept across Poland in 3 weeks, crushed France in 6, and driven to the gates of Moscow. They had commanded divisions and army groups. They had shaped the course of the most destructive war in human history. And now they sat across folding tables from American officers, answering questions. Among those conducting interviews was Hugh M. Cole, a United States Army historian attached to General George Patton's Third Army staff. Cole was a methodical man, trained to look beneath the surface of events for the structural forces that shaped them. He asked the captured commanders a deceptively simple question. Which American weapon had impressed them most during the war? The generals had faced Sherman tanks grinding through the hedgerows of Normandy. They had watched fleets of B-17 bombers, so many that they darkened the midday sky above German cities, released their payloads with mathematical precision. They had endured American artillery that seemed to fire without pause, without rationing, without any apparent concern for how many shells it was consuming. They had seen American infantry units resupplied within hours of an engagement with food, ammunition, and replacement equipment that arrived as though conjured from thin air. Yet when they answered Cole's question, the answer was almost never a tank. It was almost never a bomber. It was a small, open-topped, four-wheeled vehicle that American soldiers had taken for granted almost from the first day they drove one. A vehicle that generals rode and privates drove. A vehicle that carried the wounded, towed the guns, laid the wire, and delivered the orders that kept an army moving. The German commanders called it one of the decisive weapons of the war. The Americans who built it called it the Jeep. If you have ever wondered how a nation that ranked 17th in military strength in 1939 became the arsenal that supplied half the world by 1944, the answer begins not in Washington or in the grand strategy sessions of the combined chiefs of staff. It begins in the factories of Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania. It begins with engineers who accepted deadlines that every expert called impossible. And it begins with a catastrophic German miscalculation about what kind of country America actually was. Subscribe now if you are new here. Stories like this one, rooted in the specific and the human, are what we do every week. You will not want to miss what comes next in this account. The German misreading of American industrial potential did not emerge overnight. It was the product of years of careful, systematic analysis that reached the wrong conclusions for the right reasons, which made it all the more dangerous. Throughout the 1930s, German military intelligence compiled extensive assessments of American manufacturing capacity, workforce quality, and what the reports often referred to as national character. The men writing these evaluations were not careless or stupid. Many were trained economists and engineers who had visited American factories and studied American industrial output with genuine rigor. Their mistake was not that they failed to gather data. Their mistake was in what they believed the data meant. The picture they assembled seemed to speak for itself. In 1939, the United States Army numbered fewer than 190,000 men, ranking it 17th in the world, behind not only the major European powers but behind countries like Portugal and Romania. American military spending had been gutted during the Depression years. The great manufacturing plants of Detroit and Pittsburgh were producing refrigerators, automobiles, and domestic appliances. The arsenals were quiet. The Army's tanks were antiques. Its artillery was a generation behind European standards. When German engineers examined American consumer goods, the automobiles most famously, they found what seemed to confirm their broader assessment. The tolerances were loose by German standards. The materials were not always the finest available. The designs appeared to prioritize cheapness and ease of manufacture over technical precision. German automotive engineers trained in the exacting traditions of Mercedes-Benz and BMW, men who took genuine pride in the mastery of their craft, looked at American cars and found them crude. Functional, perhaps, in the way a carpenter's hammer is functional, but not engineering, not in the German sense of the word. This attitude pervaded German military thinking at the highest levels. Adolf Hitler returned repeatedly in his private conversations and public speeches to the theme of American softness. America was a nation of businessmen and salesmen, he argued, a mongrel society incapable of producing the kind of disciplined, technically trained soldier that German civilization had refined over generations. Its factories might be large, but size without quality was simply noise. 100 inferior machines could not match 10 excellent ones. Hermann Göring, whose Luftwaffe had reigned over European skies in the early years of the war, was contemptuous of American aviation claims. When President Franklin Roosevelt announced in a message to Congress in May of 1940 that the United States would produce 50,000 aircraft per year, Göring reportedly dismissed the figure as bluster. American factories had produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft in all of 1939. The idea of a 17-fold increase seemed, to the German air marshal, simply absurd. Propaganda for domestic consumption. The kind of inflated promise that Democratic politicians made to keep their voters calm. The Führer's assessment of American industrial claims was, if anything, more dismissive. He had spent years studying what he called the financial press of New York and had come to believe that American public life was saturated with exaggeration and self-promotion. Production figures announced in Washington were, in his view, the same commodity as campaign speeches, designed to impress, not to inform. What neither Hitler nor Göring nor the analysts of German military intelligence had fully understood was a distinction that would prove fatal to their cause. The looseness of American manufacturing tolerances was not evidence of inferior craftsmanship. It was evidence of a completely different industrial philosophy, one built not around the master craftsman and his apprentice, but around the assembly line, the interchangeable part, and the production system that could be operated by workers with weeks of training rather than years. The German approach to manufacturing was, in its own terms, genuinely excellent. Precision engineering, careful attention to material quality, designs that incorporated the latest technical refinements. A Tiger tank, examined as an object of engineering, was a more sophisticated machine than a Sherman. A Focke-Wulf 190 in the right hands was a more capable aircraft than many of what the Americans initially sent against it. German weapons, assessed 1 against 1, frequently outperformed their Allied equivalents. But 1 against 1 was not how this war would be decided. The American system, descended from the assembly line innovations of Henry Ford and the mass production philosophy that had reshaped American industry in the early 20th century, had been designed from its foundations for a different objective. Not perfection. Volume. A part manufactured in a plant in Cleveland had to fit, without adjustment, into an assembly in Detroit, and then into a vehicle maintained in a field in Tunisia. The system required that every component be standardized, that every tolerance be exactly right. Not most precise, but most repeatable. The goal was not to build the finest possible machine. The goal was to build an adequate machine, and then build it again and again and again faster than the enemy could destroy them. This distinction had been visible for decades to anyone who looked for it. But German strategic planners had looked at American consumer goods, at the cheap automobiles and the mass-market appliances, and had drawn the wrong lesson. They saw a nation that could not build excellent things. What they were actually seeing was a nation that had made a deliberate strategic choice to build sufficient things in enormous quantities. The difference between those two observations was the difference between winning and losing the war. The proof of what American industry could do arrived not in a single dramatic moment but in a cascade of numbers so large they strained comprehension. By 1944, the United States was producing approximately 2/3 of all Allied military equipment. In that single year, American factories delivered 96,000 aircraft. Not in the entire war. In 1 year. That figure alone exceeded the total aircraft production of Japan across the entire conflict. American factories built 86,000 tanks during the war. They manufactured 193,000 artillery pieces. They produced 2 million military trucks. They launched more naval tonnage in the years between 1942 and 1945 than the entire world had built in the preceding decade. The steel mills of Pittsburgh ran continuously, their furnaces never cooling. The aircraft plants of Southern California operated around the clock on rotating shifts, their workers sleeping in adjacent dormitories and returning to the line within hours. The shipyards of the Pacific coast developed the technique of prefabricating entire sections of Liberty ships in inland factories and then welding them together at the waterfront, reducing the construction time for a 10,000-ton cargo vessel from over a year to, in some cases, a matter of weeks. Henry Kaiser's Richmond Shipyard No. 2, in California, set a record in September of 1942 that became a deliberate piece of propaganda. A fully operational Liberty ship, the Robert E. Peary, assembled and launched in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. The record was staged for effect, but the effect was real. The message to Germany and Japan was explicit. We are building faster than you can sink. William Knudsen, the Danish-born former president of General Motors who left his position to lead American war production without salary, later described the Allied victory in terms that cut to the heart of what had happened. We won, Knudsen said, because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the like of which he had never seen nor dreamed possible. The phrase is worth pausing over. Not superior production, not better production, an avalanche. A quantity so overwhelming that it ceased to be a tactical advantage and became instead a geological force. Something that did not need to outmaneuver the enemy because it simply buried him. German planners had understood, in the abstract, that American industrial capacity was large. What they had failed to understand, what their entire analytical framework had prevented them from understanding, was the speed and totality of conversion. They had looked at a peacetime economy producing consumer goods and concluded that this was a permanent condition, a reflection of national character rather than a temporary allocation of resources. They had not asked the question that mattered most. How quickly can this economy convert to war production, and what happens when it does? The answer came in the months after Pearl Harbor with a velocity that stunned even those Americans who had believed in their own industrial system. General Motors retooled its automobile plants to produce aircraft engines, tanks, and artillery pieces. Ford, which had built the Model T and the Model A on the same moving assembly line that now became a metaphor for modern industrial warfare, converted its Willow Run plant in Michigan to produce B-24 Liberator bombers. At peak production, Willow Run was completing one B-24 every 63 minutes. Chrysler converted to tank production. Packard built Rolls-Royce Merlin engines under license for Allied fighter aircraft. Companies that had never made a military product in their history were producing ammunition, uniforms, optical equipment, and electronic components within 18 months of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The conversion was not smooth. There were shortages, delays, quality problems, and bitter arguments between military procurement officers and factory managers. But it happened, and it happened faster and more completely than any German strategic assessment had predicted. When German intelligence analysts had looked at American factories in the late 1930s and seen consumer goods rather than weapons, they had made an error that was, in retrospect, understandable. The German industrial system was not designed for rapid conversion. German factories, built around skilled craftsmen and precision processes, could not easily shift from one product to another. Retooling a German facility required retraining workers, redesigning processes, and often replacing specialized machinery, a slow, expensive process that the rigid structures of the German war economy made even slower. The American assembly line system, by contrast, was designed for flexibility at its core. The same principles that allowed Ford to switch from producing one model of automobile to another could be applied to switching from automobiles to tanks. The workers did not need to be retrained in new craft skills. They needed to learn new assembly sequences which could be taught in days. The machinery could be retooled because it had been designed, from the beginning, to be retooled. This was not an accident. It was the accumulated consequence of decades of industrial philosophy, of choices made by engineers and factory managers and investors across half a century of American manufacturing development. The very characteristics that German analysts had identified as weaknesses, the emphasis on standardization over precision, on volume over individual excellence, on good enough over technically perfect, were the characteristics that made the American industrial system uniquely suited to the demands of total war. There was a man in Berlin who understood the danger earlier than almost anyone else in the German leadership, and who spent the last years of the war watching his warnings go unheeded. Albert Speer was 36 years old when Hitler appointed him Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production in February of 1942. He was an architect by training, a man of genuine organizational intelligence, and one of the few figures in the Nazi inner circle who approached industrial questions with something resembling rigor. When Speer took over the armaments ministry, German war production was in a condition that would have astonished the Allied planners who feared it. German factories were running single shifts. Consumer goods production had barely been curtailed. The full weight of German industry had not been committed to the war. Speer changed that with real results. Through rationalization, centralization, and a ruthless elimination of redundancy, he roughly tripled German armaments output between 1942 and 1944. The achievement was genuine, and German production figures for tanks, aircraft, and artillery rose sharply in those years. What Speer could not do, what no one in Germany could do, was change the fundamental arithmetic of the situation. Because while German production was tripling, American production was doing something that had no historical precedent. Speer later wrote in his memoirs, published in 1969, that the moment he began receiving accurate intelligence about American industrial output, he recognized that Germany had already lost the war. Not would lose it, had lost it. The numbers from American factories did not represent a challenge to be overcome through German ingenuity and effort. They represented a physical reality that German strategy had no mechanism for addressing. The figures he saw confirmed what a small number of German analysts had been arguing since 1940, and what the German high command had consistently dismissed. American factories in 1943 delivered 46,000 aircraft. German factories, at the peak of Speer's rationalization drive, never exceeded 40,000 aircraft in a single year, and that figure was reached only in 1944, when Allied bombing was already destroying the factories almost as fast as they could be repaired. In 1943, Germany produced approximately 25,000 aircraft. The Americans produced nearly twice that number, and the gap was widening every month. The tank figures told the same story. German factories produced approximately 8,000 tanks and assault guns in 1943. American factories produced 29,000. The Soviets, whose industrial relocation program had moved entire factory complexes east of the Ural Mountains in the desperate autumn of 1941, added another 24,000. The combined Allied production in tanks alone was more than 6 times German output, and the Allied machines, while individually less formidable than a Tiger or a Panther, arrived in quantities that simply overwhelmed the capacity of German defenders to stop them all. Speer briefed Hitler on the production comparisons in late 1943. The Führer's response was characteristic. He rejected the figures. He suggested that Speer's sources were wrong, that American production claims were propaganda, that the quality differential between German and Allied weapons meant that raw numbers told only part of the story. He had been saying variations of this since 1940, and the evidence had not moved him. This was not stupidity on Hitler's part, or not only stupidity. It was the logical endpoint of a strategic framework that had been constructed from the beginning on a misunderstanding of what kind of country America was. If you believed, as the German leadership genuinely believed in 1940, that America was a nation of soft, commercially minded people incapable of industrial transformation, then production figures that contradicted this assessment had to be wrong. The framework was not built to accommodate the data. The data was therefore rejected. The human dimension of American production was something the German strategic assessments almost entirely overlooked, and it may have been the most important factor of all. The workers who built the aircraft and tanks and trucks and jeeps were not a specialized military-industrial class, selected and trained for wartime production. They were, in very large numbers, people who had never made anything like what they were now making. Women who had worked as secretaries or school teachers or shop assistants were assembling aircraft engines in plants that had been building automobiles 18 months earlier. Farmers from Kansas and Mississippi who had never set foot in a factory were learning to operate precision machine tools in training programs that lasted weeks, not years. This was possible because the American industrial system had been designed, from its foundations, to be operated by ordinary people. The principles of scientific management, the breaking down of complex manufacturing tasks into simple, repeatable steps that required skill but not mastery, had been refined in American factories over decades. Frederick Taylor had articulated the theory. Henry Ford had proven it at scale on his moving assembly line at Highland Park. By 1941, the principle had spread across virtually every sector of American industry. A German craftsman who spent 5 years learning his trade possessed something that could not be replicated in weeks. His knowledge lived in his hands, in his judgment, in his accumulated experience of how materials behaved and how tools responded. This was genuine mastery, and the weapons it produced reflected that mastery. But it was a system that could not be scaled quickly, and it was a system in which every master craftsman represented years of irreplaceable investment. When he was killed or wounded or conscripted into a different role, his knowledge went with him. The American factory worker needed to know how to do one thing well. The machine beside him did most of the rest. When he was transferred or drafted or replaced, his successor could be trained to perform the same operation in days. The knowledge lived in the system, not in the individual. The system was, in this specific sense, more resilient than its German equivalent, and in a war of attrition, resilience of process was worth more than excellence of individual craft. This was the reality that the German generals who sat across from Hugh Cole in the spring of 1945 were acknowledging, whether they fully articulated it or not, when they named the Jeep as the American weapon that had impressed them most. The Jeep was not the most powerful American weapon. It was not the most technically sophisticated. But it was everywhere, and its omnipresence was itself a form of argument. It said, "We have so many of these that we can afford to use them for everything." It said, "Our supply chain is so robust that we can put a vehicle like this in the hands of every officer, every forward observer, every liaison team, every ambulance detail." It said, "Our industry is running so far beyond your ability to damage it that the question of whether we can sustain this is not a question we are losing sleep over." The German soldiers who captured American Jeeps and used them as prized acquisitions, who classified them as Butfahrzeug and maintained formal systems for deploying them, were, in a sense, voting with their actions on a question of industrial philosophy. They were choosing the product of the system they had dismissed over the product of the system they had championed. The Kübelwagen was the more elegantly engineered vehicle. The Jeep was the one they wanted. The operational consequences of the misjudgment played out across every theater of the war, but nowhere more starkly than in the capacity to sustain an offensive. Modern warfare, by the 1940s, was above all a logistical enterprise. The ability to move men and material faster than the enemy, to replace losses faster than they were incurred, to maintain pressure across a front while the enemy was still recovering from the previous blow. These were the decisive capabilities, and they all rested on the supply chain. An army that could not be resupplied could not fight, regardless of the courage of its soldiers or the quality of its weapons. American logistical capacity in the European theater was, by 1944, something that German commanders struggled to even describe coherently in their reports. The Red Ball Express, the truck convoy system established after the breakout from Normandy to keep Patton's Third Army supplied during its rapid advance across France, ran nearly 6,000 trucks continuously, day and night, over a circuit of about 700 miles. At peak operation, it delivered approximately 12,500 tons of supplies per day. The trucks themselves were largely American-built 2.5-ton cargo vehicles, produced in numbers that reflected the same industrial philosophy as the Jeep. German logistics officers examining the Allied supply system noted with something approaching disbelief the apparent inexhaustibility of American stocks. When the Third Army ran short of fuel during the Lorraine campaign in September of 1944, the one genuine logistical crisis of the campaign, it was not because American production had failed. It was because the advance had outrun even the extraordinary capacity of the Red Ball Express to keep up. The shortage was temporary. The production was permanent. By contrast, German logistics by late 1944 were in a state of managed crisis that had been building since the losses at Stalingrad and the industrial damage from Allied bombing. Divisions at the front were regularly short of ammunition. Fuel allocations were calculated in liters rather than tons. Replacement equipment arrived in quantities that covered a fraction of losses. The Wehrmacht that German commanders led into the Ardennes offensive in December of 1944 was a force that had been scraped together from the last reserves of a nation that had been running beyond its industrial capacity for 2 years. The Battle of the Bulge, Operation Wacht am Rhein, was in some respects the final test of the German strategic thesis. Hitler's plan rested on the assumption that a sufficiently dramatic offensive success could shatter Allied cohesion and force a negotiated settlement before American production could make the outcome inevitable. It was, in this sense, an acknowledgement that time was running out. The offensive could not be sustained indefinitely. It had to achieve its political objective quickly, before the machinery of American industry reasserted its dominance. The offensive achieved tactical surprise and initial gains that alarmed Allied commanders. But it failed to capture the fuel depots at Liège that German armored columns needed to sustain the advance. It failed to take the road junction at Bastogne, where the American 101st Airborne Division held out in encirclement, resupplied by air when the weather cleared, against repeated German assaults. And it failed, most fundamentally, because the American army it attacked was an army that could absorb punishment and replace losses at a rate that no German operational plan had been designed to counter. Within weeks, the divisions that the Wehrmacht had committed to the Ardennes offensive had been destroyed or shattered, and the replacements did not exist. The American losses, significant in the initial days of surprise, were being made good before the German advance had even been halted. In the prisoner collection points of the spring of 1945, as the interviews with captured German commanders continued, a pattern emerged in the testimony that went beyond any single weapon or campaign. The generals described, in varying terms and with varying degrees of candor, a dawning recognition that had come to most of them at different points in the war. They had entered the conflict with a coherent theory of why Germany would win. The theory rested on the quality of German soldiers, the excellence of German equipment, and the assumption that the nations arrayed against Germany, France, Britain, the Soviet Union, and ultimately the United States, could not match German military professionalism and industrial sophistication. The theory had been correct about German soldiers. It had been broadly correct about the early quality of German equipment. Where it had failed catastrophically and irreparably was in its assessment of the enemy's capacity to learn, to adapt, and to produce. The Soviet Union, which German planners had expected to collapse within months of the June 1941 invasion, had instead relocated its industrial base, absorbed losses that would have destroyed most nations, and emerged from its extremity producing tanks and aircraft in quantities that matched and eventually exceeded German output. The Soviet soldier in 1945 was not the same as the Soviet soldier in 1941. He was better equipped, better led, and fighting with the confidence of an army that had turned the tide. The United States had done something different but equally decisive. It had not simply converted its existing factories to war production. It had built an entirely new industrial infrastructure at a speed and scale that had no precedent. The factories at Willow Run and the shipyards at Richmond and the assembly plants in Toledo had not existed in their wartime configuration before the war. They were new. They had been designed, built, and staffed in the years between Pearl Harbor and D-Day by a nation that the German High Command had dismissed as commercially minded and militarily soft. The lesson that emerges from this history is one about the limits of mirror imaging, the tendency to evaluate an adversary's capabilities through the lens of your own experience and assumptions. The German analysts who examined American automobiles in the 1930s and found them crude were not wrong about what they observed. American consumer goods were built to different standards than German precision equipment. What the analysts missed was that this difference reflected a deliberate choice, not an inability, and that the same organizational philosophy that produced cheap, mass-market automobiles could, when redirected, produce enormous quantities of adequate military equipment far faster than any system built around individual craftsmanship. They measured America's peacetime economy and concluded they understood America's wartime potential. The two were not the same country. Karl Probst, who had sketched the original Jeep design in 5 days on the factory floor of a struggling automobile company in Butler, Pennsylvania, died in 1963 without ever becoming famous. He had been paid $200 for work that contributed to a vehicle produced 647,000 times, distributed to Allied forces across every theater of the war, and named by captured German generals as the American weapon that had impressed them most. His obscurity was, in a peculiar way, fitting. The system he helped create was specifically designed not to depend on any individual. The genius was in the process, not the man. Delmer Roos, the Willis engineer whose Go Devil engine had won the standardization competition and powered every production Jeep through the war, returned to civilian automotive work and continued a long career in the industry. The engine he refined, not invented, but refined with such thoroughness that it became a different machine, stayed in production for decades. Civilian Jeeps carried it into the 1970s. The Willis factory in Toledo, which had produced one Jeep every 80 seconds at its peak, converted back to civilian production before the war was fully over. The first mass-produced civilian Jeep rolled off the line in 1945. Farmers, ranchers, and rural workers across America discovered immediately what military users had known for 3 years, that the vehicle went places nothing else would go, and that it kept going long after a more refined machine would have stopped. The Jeep eventually became the foundation of the entire sport utility vehicle category, a market so large that it now shapes the entire American automobile industry. The German generals who named it in their prisoner interviews could not have anticipated this civilian legacy. They were thinking about the war, about the logistics columns and the forward positions, and the realization, too late and too final, that the small boxy vehicle had been a symptom of something they had fundamentally misunderstood about the nation that built it. Hugh Cole, the Army historian who had asked the question, eventually wrote the official U.S. Army history of the Ardennes Campaign, the Battle of the Bulge, which remains one of the definitive accounts of that engagement. He had asked his question not as a provocation but as a historian's instinct to find the human detail that illuminates the larger truth. The answer he received, repeated across interview after interview, became part of the record of how the war had really been decided. Not in the dramatic engagements that filled the headlines, but in the factories and the assembly lines and the engineering offices where ordinary people working impossible hours made decisions that seemed small and proved to be enormous. William Knudsen, who had left the presidency of General Motors to run American war production without a salary, had described the outcome as an avalanche of production, the like of which the enemy had never seen nor dreamed possible. The description was accurate in its scale, but it missed something in its emphasis on the impersonal. The avalanche had been made by people. By Karl Probst working through the night on a factory floor. By Delmer Roos running his test engine for 100 hours and finding it still turning. By the welders and the assembly workers and the tool and die makers and the truck drivers of the Red Ball Express, all of them doing their specific, limited, repeatable job as part of a system that was larger than any of them individually and more powerful than any of them could fully see. The German generals had looked at that system in 1939 and seen a peacetime economy producing consumer goods. They had looked at American workers and seen softness. They had looked at American industry and seen loose tolerances and cheap materials. They had constructed, from these observations, a strategic theory that predicted German victory. The Jeep was one of the things that proved them wrong. Not the only thing and not the most dramatic thing, but perhaps the most eloquent. A simple, rugged, four-wheeled machine that appeared wherever the fighting was, in numbers that never seemed to run out, doing everything that needed doing, going everywhere that needed to be gone. Faithful as a dog, strong as a mule, agile as a goat. 647,000 times, American workers made the argument that industrial democracy could outproduce totalitarian efficiency. The German generals who spent the spring of 1945 answering questions in Allied prisoner compounds had spent 6 years on the other side of that argument. They knew by then who had won it. If this story gave you something to think about, please consider leaving a like. It helps us reach more people who care about the real history of the Second World War. Subscribe so you never miss the next account, and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. These stories belong to all of us, and this community, wherever you are, is part of how they stay alive.